Today we're going to take a look at classical China. Now, all of these empires and civilizations during the classical period had different time spans as far as how long they lasted. The classical period as a whole, we date from 600 BCE to 600 CE, a 1200-year period. So what we have here with classical China is a little shorter time period. It's from about 200 BCE to 200 CE, so only 400 years. So relatively much shorter than the whole classical period altogether. However, the Chinese did manage to put together some remarkable achievements, including setting some key precedents that are going to guide the Chinese for the next 2,000 years, really. So first we talk about, well, how does China get to this point? We learned during the early period, during the early river valley civilizations, you had the last of those dynasties was the Zhou dynasty, and it ends in chaos. You end up with a feudal time period. In other words, there is no centralized government. Local lords, warlords are in control of their given region, and it's depending upon what your status in life is, it's not exactly the best time to be alive. And so that's going to last for about 200 years, the period of warring states. And that's until the Qin dynasty comes along. Now, the Qin dynasty adopts something called legalism, and it's a term we'll talk about later on here, but legalism becomes the way of thinking all across China, especially among those in leadership positions, because legalism basically says in order to maintain order or establish order, you do it at all costs. But we'll talk about legalism here in a little bit, but it has to be mentioned here because it's the basis for the Qin dynasty. Now, the Qin dynasty is considered the first true dynasty of China, yet ironically, it only lasts for 14 years. Or depending upon the historian you talk to, maybe upwards of 35 years. Either way, at the very beginning of this dynasty, you have a huge boost in agricultural production. You have, because you have a new centralized power dictating agricultural output, things are going to get better, population is going to grow, improved military technology is going to help with the Qin dynasty coming to power. And the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, and he is known as the first emperor. Now, like I said, his empire lasts just a few years, but he sets the key precedent of a centralized bureaucracy. That means, first of all the power is coming from the central government, and then he has a huge bureaucracy, a group of people who carry out their specific jobs with his orders in mind. So what this does is it puts people in positions of power who are actually qualified to do their job. And it weakens the aristocracy, the landowning people, because now their position is going to be subservient to the centralized power. The regional armies that they had seen during the period of warring states, they're going to be disarmed, and you're going to have one centralized military power. You end up with huge, massive public works starting, including a precursor to the Great Wall of China, which, by the way, wasn't something that was built all at once. It was several series of walls that were built over time. Nonetheless, that really begins, and we'll talk about the Great Wall in a little bit, as well as many, many roads. Qin Shi Huangdi, however, was not liked by the other two groups of thinkers in China, or scholars, and that's Confucianists and Taoists, who will both come up here in a little bit. Basically, the Qin dynasty was all about maintaining order, and in order to do that, you can't have people with contrary opinions. And scholars, people who think for themselves, tend to have contrary opinions. And so Qin Shi Huangdi was famous or infamous for having 460 scholars buried alive. He also burned books on philosophy, ethics, history, literature. So you can see he was not a friend of the intellectual. Nonetheless, he does do some important things for China. First of all, take a look at the map here. We see, we don't have a comparison here, but this is a much larger piece of land that China has under its control than under the Zhou dynasty. You see the constructions of various pieces of the Great Wall. And again, that's to keep out the nomads from the north, or at least that's the attempt of it. But what they do here is they make China unified, not just politically, but with certain cultural things. So you have laws that are the same all across the land. The currency, that's always a big one, is the same across the land. And by having a common currency, no matter if you're in the east, west, north, or south, and you travel to have that, that's going to make you feel part of one entity, a unified China. Same with weights and measures for trade and so forth. That's going to be key. But probably the most important thing that helped to give China its unification was a common script. The idea of having one single written language for communication. As you can imagine, during the Warring States period, people, for 200 years, you have people going to maybe their local dialects, their regional way of doing things. People probably aren't traveling much beyond their local borders because of the period of warring states. So this is going to be important. Like I said, the dynasty is very short, but it sets some key precedents. The most important of all, probably, that China will have a centralized government. All good things must come to an end, some earlier than others, and the Qin dynasty collapses due to a rebellion. And it's not surprising that somebody who makes so many enemies is going to have so many people unhappy with his way of doing things. And the rebellion comes about after Chen Shi Huangdi is killed a year after his death. Of course, here we have you may already be aware of these, but the famous terracotta soldiers, built by 700,000 Chinese craftsmen. And again, much like we saw with like ancient Egypt and so forth, the Chinese believed in the afterlife. And here he has an army of 15,000 soldiers going into the afterlife with him. Not just soldiers, but there was also slaves, concubines, craftsmen, who were actually sacrificed and buried to go with their emperor so that he could take them into the afterlife. The terracotta soldiers were unearthed in 1974, and it was a huge, remarkable find, and they're still actually finding some of them today, or they're still unearthing that region of China and finding more of his massive underground tomb. The remarkable thing about the terracotta soldiers was each soldier was unique. Each soldier's face was different. No two were alike in any way. And historians believe that they were actually modeled after real-life people. So the Qin dynasty falls, but fortunately for China, there's someone waiting to pick up the void, to fill in the void. There's no long wait. There's no return to the period of warring states, as you're going to have the Han dynasty step in. So that's where we're going to cut this lesson off, and then in the next lesson, we're going to look at the Chinese schools of thought, which we already mentioned all three of them: legalism, Confucianism, and Taoism. Some of them you can consider Taoism as a religion. Confucianism to some people is religion-y, but not really. And legalism isn't a religion, it's just a philosophy on how to govern and act. We're going to talk about all three of those and how they play an important role during this period in Chinese history.